Hello and welcome to episode 10 of Humanism Now, the podcast from the Central London Humanists for anybody active or just curious about humanism. I'm your host James, and this week we're going to be talking all about the relationship between comedy and freethought. Why are so many comics humanists? And should any topics be off limit to comedy? All that, plus we'll have our guest interview with entrepreneur and stand-up comedian Lisa May. So to delve into these topics this week, I'm pleased to be joined by two of our regular panelists, Nicole and AJ of Young Humanists and Leicester Humanists and Central London Humanists, respectively. Nicole, welcome back. Since we're talking all about comedy this week, I was wondering, what is your go-to TV show that you can rely on to always make you laugh?
So mine is Peep Show. It's absolutely my favourite, probably TV show of all time, but particularly comedy. It had its 20-year anniversary of its first episode about a month ago, which is kind of amazing to me because it still feels so fresh. Even the old series, it's just so funny. And I love the exploration of kind of failure and bad people in comedy. I think it's a lot of British comedy does that really well. It's kind of like really tragic figures kind of exploring why they are so awful to everybody in kind of understandable ways, but you recognize they're horrible, but you still kind of sympathize. But also it's just really funny. There's quite a lot of great comedy like that, but I could go on about for a while.
Yeah, and thank you for making us all feel so old and telling us it's 20 years since Peep Show came out.
No, isn't it awful? And it also had its first, the first night it aired was the same night the first episode of Little Britain aired, which is a strange fact.
Quite a coincidence.
Yeah.
One has aged better than the other.
Absolutely.
And AJ, good to have you back. Good to see you again. Same question to you. What's your go-to TV comedy show?
Thanks, James. Wonderful to be back. And great that we made it to 10. Next up, 100 episodes, I think. So looking forward to that. Thanks for guiding us through it. Comedy TV shows. I would say I'm quite an Americophile, I think, with a lot of my popular culture, despite never having lived there. So I would say Seinfeld or Curb Your Enthusiasm. I would say I love observational humor. I love things that kind of prick the ego, or where people are, like Larry David's character is in Curb, where people are just quite bare bones about their eccentricities and weirdness. And even though they know to do better, they would just sort of insist and blindly carry on anyway in the hope that somehow it will work or make the other person feel more awkward than they are themselves. And so I love all of that. And Curb's been going for more than 10, 11 seasons, and it's still quite fresh. I think they're in the same vein, Seinfeld and Curb, kind of in different ways. Observational humor, shows about nothing, no real plot as such, or character development or anything like that, but just scenes and scenarios, which I think will stay with you. So I'll go with that.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme of the tragic hero.
The one that he's always right. You know, everyone misunderstands him, and he's the one that's kind of educating us about we live in a society. And I live in cities. You know, I've always lived in cities my whole life. So being around so many people, just the hustle and bustle of going into a restaurant, or you go on public transport or at work, you have to kind of navigate all of these social cues and cultures, especially multiculturally, America or the UK, and there's a lot of scope for comedy there. And I think through that, being able to laugh at each other and at ourselves can help, I guess, sort of feed a lot of humanist values about being tolerant and about being understanding, and understanding that we all have weird parts about ourselves. So it's just about making sure that we can laugh about them and remain lighthearted, and through that find a way to love each other.
I also love Seinfeld, and it's that similar thing where, all the characters are kind of horrible people and who refuse to grow, which this is something great about that for comedic purposes, but not the lesson that we should take from it.
No, there's a theme to the characters that you like, Nicole.
Yeah.
That's great. No, I'd say my go-to, if I was going to throw on just any random episode, would be the US version of The Office. that still delivers every time. I think I've watched it all the way through twice. It starts off slow. It starts off similar, I think, to, as you mentioned, that it's very little happens. They just get put in uncomfortable situations. But when they really develop all the characters over the course of the 10 seasons, and the situations get more and more outrageous as well as you go. So yeah, once you know the characters, you can just watch any episode and it still delivers.
It's quite an interesting thing with The Office, because obviously it started as a almost carbon copy of the British Ricky Gervais Stephen Merchant one, and then morphed into a more American show. And I think, it's just very different, actually. I wouldn't say better or worse. It's a completely different show.
It becomes completely different, and I think they're forced to develop other characters.
Yeah.
Which helps with its longevity. But that's great. Thank you for that. So I think, as AJ touched on there, there's a lot we can take as humanists from engaging and watching comedy. And it's interesting when you look through the list of Humanist UK patrons, just how many comedians are listed on there and how many of them would identify as humanist. And I think even more, particularly stand-up comics from the last 20, 30 years were openly atheist or critical of religion in their routines. So we're curious, as we're promoting our Christmas comedy event coming up, to get your thoughts on why you think there is such a relationship between comedy and freethought in particular. AJ, what do you think that stems from?
That's an excellent question. Thanks, James. Yeah, I've often thought about this myself. I've become a fan of comedy, particularly stand-up comedy, and just being my philosophical self, I've read autobiographies of comedians and tried to sort of get into their mindset. And one concept there that I think could relate to this question is that comedy is a lot about deconstruction. So say, for example, a normal act, you go up to a door, you open it, and you walk through it. It's not very funny. But if you start breaking down each step, okay, so I'm going to walk up to the door. Or what if I put my foot near the door and then I fall through a hole, or the plank in the floor falls through the floor panel, and then I go to reach out for the door handle and then it comes off, and then I have to try and find another way to open the door. And then you break up a simple action like that into its constituent steps, and then you find comedy in the ways they can fail or in all of those. So that's a very simple example in everyday action. So if you take that same principle to believing in God, or the philosophy of, why do bad things happen to good people? So I think that kind of a mindset may naturally bring comedians or people who appreciate comedy in that kind of a certain way. Of course, there's different kinds of comedy who are naturally able to deconstruct ideas and question ideas in the way that they just look at life, and that's why they appreciate comedy. And I know that, for example, Jerry Seinfeld, I mentioned Seinfeld earlier, and Larry David, but many other comedians, Steve Martin, it's universal about for comedians generally. But I think specifically some of these comedians that I've looked into and understood, because I've never done it myself, I understand, okay, what's their mental thought process when they go through writing a bit. And it's all about this. It's all about observation, questioning. People do that all the time, but actually have they thought what would happen if that one thing went wrong? And that's where the comedy comes in. It's sort of breaking those constituent parts down. So I think maybe that could have something to do with you can then start questioning some of the bigger ideas. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect maybe is that just the futility of the human condition. We often don't know things as well as we thought we do. For everything that we find out, say in science, there's 10 more questions that spring out, and there's kind of a hopeless tragedy and comedy in the fact that we can't get a grasp on love, relationships, parents, money, all of these things that are often dating, are often the subject of comedy routines. So because we're kind of, it's a slippery slope and it's a Sisyphus complex that we seem to have, that's also, I think, a ripe field for harvesting for a comedian. So I think all of these are adjacent concepts and ideas to humanism. I could have something to do with that, I think.
Yeah, no, that's all really interesting, AJ. I definitely agree. Particularly what you were talking about with kind of futility of life, as is already established. I think that's what I really like about comedy, and the good sort of comedy, exploring those kind of, the nothingness that makes up life, and the lack of greater given meaning to our lives. Obviously, it doesn't make it meaningless, as we know as humanists, but exploring those little things that just make up life and the little minutiae, that is funny when you look at it through an absurd lens. I also think that a lot of comedians, a lot of people who are very into comedy, are big overthinkers. And I think a lot of humanists can be as well. And again, I mean, that's what makes Seinfeld funny. I think it's just overthinking every single tiny little thing. But also, it's where good jokes come from, in my opinion, is kind of if you know a lot about something, whatever that thing is, if it's just sitting around doing nothing in cities, that's how you make funny jokes. And I think humanists tend to be, they'll specialize, whether that is, socializing in cities, if that's their speciality. If you know a lot about it, if you do a lot about it, you can have funny insights and funny observations about that.
Definitely, yeah. I think there's definitely a similarity between approaches to comedy and being curious-minded, in that the comedian is there really to just keep probing and keep asking questions. And it's coming up with those unifying themes. What are the things that we all do every day, or that we all notice, or that we all participate in, but perhaps we don't notice, or we don't stop to question, why do we do this? And I think that's why there is this link between, or historically there was the link between making fun of religion, because obviously that was previously a unifying belief, perhaps practices for most people in the audience. And so there was a turn, probably in the 90s, I think, where suddenly comedians felt more comfortable that they could use that as a source for source for comedy, and start to, gently probe some of the norms that were there. And I think it's developed from there, really. So I think it's a couple of things, really, isn't it? It's the questioning, constant questioning, and also trying to find these unifying themes for everyone.
I think that there's a rich tradition of going back even to colonial or feudal times in previous eras of human civilization. The court jester or the clown who's in the court next to the king or next to the ruler will often be able to question things, quite radical ideas, or just sort of make fun of established authority. It could be the bishops also in the courtroom, or in the palace, that then maybe a normal minister or a diplomat couldn't do. So saying quite radical ideas in a comedic way, experimental way, and experimental then links into science, experimenting with ideas, not sort of having to say something and then completely believe in it, or having to commit to something, but just like Plato said famously, life must be lived as play. And I think that's very, very true, because it's with playing around with ideas that we then understand, okay, what do I actually believe? Where's my identity? What am I comfortable with? And all of that leads into humanist free thought, and ideas of liberation and freedom. So I think we need to hang on to comedy. It's very precious.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a really good point. And the fact that I think bringing those maybe radical, absurd ideas, even if people don't believe them, it's like it really helps us to rethink what we think and our actions and beliefs, even if it's posited in an absurd way that you're not supposed to agree with that jester or comedian. It's like, oh yeah, you think, oh, why do I believe this actually? Is this ridiculous? So it's a gateway to research.
Yes, yeah. As my ex-Muslim friends say, they tell us we have to expand the floor of the cage, so allow for there to be more room for people to question things, and sometimes by saying quite radical things, and they would argue maybe even blasphemous things. By saying that, they then allow more breathing space for people who aren't as radical, who aren't stand-up comedians at the edge of society, at the fringes, to then have more space to question their own beliefs or have discussions in their own families or friends or communities. So, they're important standard bearers, I think, as you say, Nicole.
And it's an important method for questioning authority. And in fact, I think it's quite interesting that there are points that can be made through comedy that perhaps would be difficult to make in a more serious format. And sometimes it's a freer way to introduce potentially, as you say, radical or controversial topics. Because if you frame it in the guise of a joke, then it just gets, it's more of a light-hearted teasing, but it does get people thinking. And I think that's also part of what's happening in comedy is, yes, it's lighthearted and relaxing and fun, but there is an element of getting people to think about topics that they wouldn't otherwise have questioned. I think there's perhaps another principle that's core to humanism that leads in here as well. And when we talk about giving life meaning, and part of the definition is often that we believe that humans give ourselves, or we find our own meaning, and we look to create meaning for others. And I think what better way to enjoy life than to laugh. There's an important contribution from comedy to just helping people to enjoy their lives. And I wondered, with that, were there any comedians or potentially shows, but particularly individuals, who first helped you realize that you could question or make fun of some of religious doctrine? AJ, is there anyone who stands out to you?
I think quite easily George Carlin. I grew up in an atheist family, so I never belonged to a religion. And my household was quite a philosophical one, so there was always sort of people, intellectuals hanging around, visiting my dad or my granddad, who didn't have that much respect for religion, to put it lightly. So those ideas weren't completely new to me, that I already found that within my family. But seeing George Carlin, just in the way that what he embodied in stand-up, the professionalism, the anger that he had, his oratory skills were just dazzling. And also being an American as well, because as I grew up and got more curious about this, this world superpower, this hegemon, I was toying with the idea that, how can the American people sort of be so blind, et cetera, and let this happen? And I sort of growing up and waking up around the time of the Iraq War. So that was my kind of first foray into American culture, and how particularly, say, Jon Stewart, George Carlin, other American comedians and late night talk show hosts were handling this. And I was very inspired by, especially The Daily Show and Jon Stewart, so as well as George Carlin. And he was a revelation in that you could see here's a very intelligent, very conscientious American who's using his morals, but also his comedy to interact, to communicate with his fellow Americans and the public, which I found very inspirational from a humanistic point of view and as a social activist, as I was growing up to be at that time, and also just being very funny in his observations and pointing out the ironies and pointing out the tragedies. He was angry, but people were laughing, so I found that remarkable.
Yeah, Carlin definitely stood out for me as well. But again, I came to him a bit later. I only really discovered him in retrospect, more recently. And I think it's important to remember the climate and the culture in which he was releasing.
So brave.
It was very brave. This was very new. He's probably the first to really, certainly mainstream comic, to really go, deep into religion in such a way. And I think, but he brought the audience along with him.
Yes.
It was still under a unifying message. It was under a compassionate message, even though, as you said, there was an anger there. Because there's an excellent bit that we can probably link to where he kind of rewrites the 10 Commandments to just basically be kind to each other. And it comes from that place of wanting to still bring people along in a unifying, positive message.
And what he's saying will often be, I listen to that and think, actually, he's talking about me. That I do some of these things that he's talking about, maybe consumerism or things like that. It's the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. All of these things, consumerism, materialism. I was trying to also fight in my own life, but he had an excellent way of, because that may make some people in the audience feel self-conscious or maybe be resistant towards him or have a hostility towards him or a bitterness, but it didn't. And he had that magic way of, okay, well, listen, actually, you and me, all of us, we're caught up in this thing. So let's not, fight amongst each other, but let's just sort of laugh at and identify this sort of horrible toxicity that's in our society and realize that in a common humanity, we can find and rise above this together, or at least that's how it sort of seemed to me. So even though it just seemed like he was an angry, village idiot or town crier standing up there and just everything was meticulously planned. It was written, like all of his bits were, again, looking at his autobiography and documentaries about him, fiercely intelligent guy, emotionally, had that emotional intelligence, that psychological understanding. as well as also just a great IQ and knowledge about the world as well.
Yeah, it was always from the perspective of we. This is something we all do. And I think it goes back to that point that was mentioned earlier. A lot of this, it's not always about punching up and speaking truth to power. A lot of it is just finding the space to laugh at ourselves and notice the things that we all do that are absurd, or the norms that we all follow. And I think creating an atmosphere where people can be relaxed to laugh at those things does create the environment where they can question them as well. Nicole, anyone who stands out for you?
So I didn't have the same experience of seeing anyone who was explicitly atheist or humanist or non-religious as part of their comedic shtick. But I think what happened for me is that I would find people in comedians or comedic actors and that I really liked, and then would find out that they usually were humanists. And as soon as you see that thread coming along, it's more of it, but it's more subtle than George Carlin explicitly talking about religion. Obviously, one big example is Stephen Fry, who's obviously a massive Humanist UK patron and talks a lot about humanism and his way into that. Whereas I just remember watching him, really enjoying him. I mean, I might be wrong. I'm not an expert on him, but I don't think he does very much like comedic stand-up about atheism in that sense. But it was just really liking his attitude to life, and then looking and being like, oh, he's a humanist, as are these 10 other comedians that I already liked. So again, it's like going back to what we said at the beginning. It's kind of that attitude to life that makes a lot of humanist comedians, rather than any explicitly atheist themes in comedians that I found early on.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, I think it's not that they have to be explicitly critical as well. That actually it's more about their approach to these matters. And I've definitely had that experience as well of finding someone who I think is engaging, intelligent, thoughtful, wanting to find out more about them, and then discovering, oh, actually they are a humanist, but they don't, as you say, openly go out and preach or criticize. And there's a quiet power in that as well. I think one more name I'd like to throw in, perhaps before we move on, for me, who was really important, was Eddie Izzard in the mid-90s, who had a completely different approach. It was more a case of taking some of the Bible stories. I particularly remember his routine about Noah's Ark, and I don't think you could call it critical. It was more just creating imaginary scenarios of what might have happened in his very absurdist, almost like Monty Python-like manner, which I don't think anybody could have taken as an insult or a criticism, because that was his approach to everything. Was just, okay, well, let's make this story more absurd. Let's make this more ridiculous by introducing the talking animals and putting God on a jet ski, that kind of thing. So, and again, it just relaxes people around dealing with these issues.
You mentioned Monty Python there. I mean, we'd be remiss to have a humanist podcast about comedy and not mention, Monty Python, Life of Brian, The Meaning of Life, Holy Grail. And those were, again, I think they really speak to, apart from just exhibiting humanist ideas of skepticism and free thinking, the absurdist element of them, the surreal element, I think speaks to a way that humanism can appeal to people without an intellectual background, so without the academic package and, well, here's the philosophical reason why you shouldn't believe in God. Well, no, okay, that's one reason. But here's also the absurd reason why you shouldn't believe in God. It's just surreal. And as we said before, deconstructing those elements. Okay, that Jesus is in a manger and they're coming with gifts, but let's deconstruct that. What if they went to the wrong manger and it was going to go next door? So just like we said before about coming to open the door handle and the door handle falls off, that idea of, okay, let's question the established narratives and find spaces in there where we can think of other things that could have happened and use our imagination and use our curiosity to insert and find moments of comedy or surrealism there. I think it's the core way that I think comedy and humor can sort of combine together to create this recipe for enjoying life and extracting the most meaning out of life. So a hat to Monty Python, certainly, from me.
Yeah, very good point. We shouldn't have a conversation about comedy or any of the comedians or shows we've mentioned without mentioning Monty Python. And I think that's another really interesting case, because I've heard interviews with some of the Pythons that were recorded since, and it's not clear whether they were people of faith themselves. I think some of them may well have been, actually. But their point was more to say, I think there was a quote where potentially Palin is saying, look, if we believe this guy came down from Earth with this really positive message, why have we spent the last 2,000 years arguing about exactly what he said? And that was more what they were trying to get across. Again, not to be critical of the religion itself, but more to encourage people to behave a bit better.
And if people haven't seen it, talking about Monty Python and interfacing with the religious discussion on authority at the time, there's an excellent late night talk show interview with Michael Palin and John Cleese, and also I think it was a bishop, and then also another film critic maybe, who was also, they're both Christian. And that discussion between the four of them really, really outlines, I think, how Monty Python, and they're not trying to be funny necessarily, but they end up being funny because the questions they're answering from the religious authority figures there on the panel in that talk show are just so absurd. And they're trying to be empathetic, humanistic. They're not trying to poke fun at, because the arguments that they're being faced with are, how can you make fun of this religion which provided, Da Vinci and all this great art and creativity and provides comfort to so many people? And they're saying, of course we're not. We're not making fun of that at all. That's not the absurdist part. The absurdist part is the other things that we point out in it, and how we as humans have misinterpreted the message. We end up being our own. It's not as if Jesus is our enemy. We're our own worst enemy, or at least the worst parts of our nature. That's what we're making fun out of. And you're kind of proving the point by taking the wrong interpretation of what we're saying and using that as a club to beat us over the head with. So they show a lot of humanistic empathy there, I think, while still being funny and comedic, and not sort of completely bowing to the religious authority or bowing to public pressure or stigma. So it's quite a memorable interview. It's on YouTube, but I'd recommend our audience to go and give that a look if they've not seen it before.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example. I mean, you covered it really well, AJ, but of making fun of the religion in a way, but it's not mocking the people who follow it or its core tenets. It's not cruel. It's just absurd. And I think that's the core thing, is joking about religion. If your intentions are not to be mean to like random religious people or just criticize for the sake of criticizing, rather to apply that just human absurdity to something that I think for a lot of us growing up, religion is like absolutely sacred. It's all perfect. And watching something like The Life of Brian, where everyone's like, ridiculous, but they're still in this religious garb. It was really, entertaining and fun. I think I know quite a lot of Christians who like that film, because it's not insulting. It's just funny.
Yeah, a lot of the jokes are really at the idea of groupthink, aren't they? It's not about the message. It's about it's that kind of cascading effect of something gaining a lot of momentum, and then suddenly everybody's outside
the telephone game and mishearing or misinterpreting things, or having to add your own bit. If I'm spreading the gossip or the message, it wasn't quite good enough, so let me spice it up with something that didn't happen, and then spread that down the line, and then it ends up being a miracle. He walked on water, or he converted water into wine. But human foibles, I think that they expose those very well.
Do you think that religion as a topic for comedy is still quite as edgy or funny?
Of course, yeah. So in a way, no. I think a lot of it is that, I think you mentioned kind of since the 90s, we're talking about Britain as one example. We've become a lot less religious. A lot less people are raised with religion in a serious way. You might get some quite like vague religiosity, but I rarely meet people my age who are very religious and have been raised very, very religious. And I think then it links back to that thing I said earlier about the funniest jokes come from truly understanding. And, again, like we're talking about The Life of Brian, if you've been raised with that religion and you now think it's absurd or has absurd elements, your jokes are going to be very funny because you get it and you get why it's absurd. Whereas if you're just like coming at it from someone who was raised an atheist, never believed in God, and if you're just coming at this like, isn't religion dumb? It's like, well, it's not offensive. I mean, I'm not offended, but as a religious person, it might be offensive to some people, but it's just not funny because it's not a very good insight. And I think as well, a lot of the funniest jokes have been done in that way. And what was once shocking, someone, and we were talking about American comedy, I know that the word atheist there is still a lot more shocking than it is like in Britain. But the fact that people like George Carlin are so, were so outspoken about that, it's kind of like that, the shock factor of that, not that that's why he was doing it, has kind of been done quite a lot, I think, now.
It's certainly been normalized a lot more, and I think potentially through a lot of this culture, these views and opinions have been broadly accepted, and they've helped to shift the cultural dial on a lot of these topics. So yeah, it doesn't have the same power. It's not like it's not really punching up, criticizing authority anymore.
Absolutely. It's just kind of, because now, like I said, this country is very not religious, and those who are religious are often not as strict as they were, 50 years ago.
AJ, do you think potentially there's still a place for that type of comedy in other countries where perhaps religion still plays a bigger role in society?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. There's so many aspects to it. There's the UK aspect or Western US aspect, and there's also, Malaysia, for example, or Indonesia, and comedians there and how they handle that. I think let's start off in the Western sphere first. I think yes, that there's more room, as you, Nicole, have said, because religion has sort of lost that aura of it's God sovereign or representative on earth, and it's some kind of divine holy writ that it can't be touched, as it was maybe in the era when Monty Python had that interview defending Life of Brian. In the UK. So it's lost that status a bit because of the internet and more free thought and the education system and more secular cultures being more widespread. But on the other hand, I think when religion becomes intertwined with identity politics, the war on terror, the post-Iraq war era, again, when I've become woke, I've started waking up as a conscientious individual. I was 11 when the Iraq war happened, and the war on terror and what's happened since then, and how, say, for example, Islam and Islamism, and as well as many other religions have identified themselves quite openly with, not that they weren't doing so before in the previous century, but now, especially since the 2001, 2003 era. Because that's happened, then maybe there's a bit more of a pushback in terms of if you criticize something that comes from a religion, people then see that as a criticism of themselves. And it's very hard to, again, unless you're a genius like George Carlin and you know exactly how to navigate those waters, and not everyone can do that. And there's a reason why there's only a few of them that we sort of would put on the Mount Rushmore of comedy. For me, George Carlin would be one of them. So many comedians are trying to do that and failing, and maybe they have to sort of avoid university campuses now, as many stand-up comedians do, or avoid certain topics because they realize it's more trouble than it's worth. So I think religion, yes, especially in the West, is still as funny, if not more funny, because of that loss of authority. But there are some potential landmines because of the politicization of it. And I think that's then a social justice and political project to make sure that these discussions are able to be had in a healthy way, and that we don't have the hijacking of religious sacred cows by political projects who want to use religion and who want to use people's feelings and people's sort of sense of dignity as a way to protect religious projects and protect political projects, and insulate them from criticism, from comedic criticism or from other political criticism. And I think sometimes that's done cynically, but sometimes that's just done, in the natural course of societal discourse. So I think that it's not like a law of nature that it can, it's always going to be that way and we're never going to get it back. I think that has to be resisted, and most importantly by members of those communities themselves. As Nicole said, within the religious communities, there are people who want to stand up, especially in the younger generations, stand up for, I represent this religion, I have these beliefs, I'm not going to back down from that, but I am mature enough and our religion is strong enough to laugh at itself, to have a bit of humor, because we know that that's how we get a healthy, friendly, loving community, is to have a bit of that rather than just being some kind of a cult or authoritarian community that has the diktats imposed where, like Big Brother, you can't, you'll commit thought crime if you ever think of anything that could possibly be funny and undermine the religion. So I think it's it's funny. There's comedy there if we're willing to fight for it.
Really important points, AJ. Thanks for highlighting that. And yeah, I definitely agree that it's a sign of strength in your convictions if you're willing to allow it to be gently mocked as well. Nicole, AJ, thank you so much for that enlightening discussion. Now, as mentioned, Central London Humanists will be hosting our Christmas party this year with some special guest stand-up comics from around London. One of them is Lisa May, and I'm delighted to say that Lisa joined me for an interview earlier this week.
Hi, my name is Lucy Potter and I'm a researcher based at the University of Sheffield. I am currently conducting research on how asylum claims on the grounds of non-religiosity, which can include apostasy and blasphemy, are handled by the UK government. I am looking for refugees or people who are still seeking asylum on these grounds to take part in an interview with me on their experiences of the asylum system. This research is really important because there is no research on how non-religious asylum claims are dealt with currently, and not much is known about non-religious persecution more widely. If you take part in this research, you will remain anonymous and unidentifiable, and I hope this research will make the asylum system inclusive of all belief systems, and I encourage anyone with experience to please contact me. My email is lpotter2@sheffield.ac.uk. Thank you.
Lisa May is a stand-up comedian and humanist based in London. After working for 15 years in business and eventually growing and selling her own company, Lisa had enough of being serious and signed up for a stand-up comedy course. And now she's performed more than 100 gigs, including at the Big Belly and the Comedy Store in London. And she regularly runs and MCs her own comedy night, Stand Up Lols. Lisa May, thank you for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. So you'll be joining us at our Christmas comedy gig in a couple of weeks. It's been great to meet so many local comics, and also mostly they're also members of Humanist UK and fellow humanists as well. It'd be great to find out a little bit more about, I guess, what motivated you to make the transition into stand-up comedy, and a little bit more about your life and why you choose to identify as a humanist.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Norway, from northern Norway, in fact, so very north of the wall. And I came to the UK in 1999, and I had quite a challenging upbringing. And I know that a lot of people are surprised by that, being Norwegian, because you think this is where everything is. It's a socialist country with a lot of support from everywhere, you would think. But I had a challenging childhood. My mother was alcoholic, and my dad was a fisherman that was away a lot. So through a lot of responsibility in my childhood, I decided to move to the UK when I was 20 on my own, 3 suitcases, without wheels, by the way. This was 1999. And I moved to London to be an au pair to start with, which is quite common. In the 90s and noughties, there were a lot of au pairs in London. And I had started university, but didn't really feel that it was the right thing for me. So
is that studying in the UK or in Norway?
In Norway. In Norway, the university is free. And so most people do go to university, but I have some learning disabilities. I'm dyslexic and I have ADHD, or ADD actually, but doing the studies were always quite challenging for me. And I think for a long time I thought I wasn't that smart, or I was told a lot that I wasn't that smart. And so, through my kind of childhood challenges and traumas, and being told a lot that I couldn't do things, something really interesting happened. And I think this is the start of what became my journey into business and then comedy. I really believe that if you don't have the kind of traditional support from people and encouraging you, there is something interesting that doesn't always happen, but definitely happened to me, is that the self-belief, it's not self-confident, it's very much like self-belief of what I thought I could do, became very strong. Like I knew that I didn't really need people to tell me that I could do something, because I'd never really had that. I developed that skill in myself. And so I when I decide things, I very much go, I think I can do this. So I just start and I just do it. And I think that that's kind of the usual fear that is in people of failing. I didn't really have, mostly because I didn't have anything of any significance in terms of support or money, or so for me it was more like, if I think I can, I will just do it. And that was the start for me when I came to the UK. I was like, well, I don't have a degree, but I know I'm interested in a lot of things. And that, although my mum was alcoholic, she was very much a thinker, and I would say quite philosophical, and always helped me make my own mind up about everything, like including religion. When I was quite young, she sent us to Sunday school, although she was a humanist herself, but she thought it was really important for everyone to make their own minds up. So although she was quite a challenging person, she taught me a lot about myself and trusting my own instinct, and having critical thinking to any problem or any challenge, and not be defeatist. Ironically enough, the person that taught me the most was the person that was probably the most broken. But I do think that's really so common in life. There is a saying that the blessed are the broken ones, because they let in the light. And I do feel like that is very true.
That's where is that saying from?
I think they've been referred to as quite a few different people having said it. I can't quite remember what the author of it, but it's similar sayings that I said in a lot of different backgrounds. I think a lot of it also comes from Japan. I have a slight obsession with Japan and the Japanese culture, and they have this thing in Japan where something breaks and then they fix it with gold glue, because something that's broken is more special because of its brokenness.
Yes, you can turn its imperfections into something beautiful.
Exactly.
That's and so it sounds like you've always sought out these opportunities that other people may find daunting or challenging. You seem to revel in that that ability to dive straight in.
Yes, I do think that for me it is. I'm so interested in life and in experiencing and seeking knowledge and finding connections, that the only real way of doing that is to throw yourself in and give it a go.
And do you find that approach to curiosity and connections influences your approach to comedy?
Oh, yes, for sure. Yes, it definitely does. Just the fact that I'm in comedy, like most of my friends were quite shocked. In fact, I have a whole joke about how shocked everyone was about me going into comedy, because I had been very focused and very serious for a very long time. And it's that kind of thinking where a lot of people see you as one person or one type of personality, and they get quite shocked if you adapt or you change. But I've always been quite funny. I think I've always appreciated humor in everything I do, so I don't think it's surprising.
And do you see a lot of transferable skills from your time as an entrepreneur or working in the corporate business world that you've been able to take to your stand-up comedy career?
So when I first started stand up, I thought I would have a lot of transferable skills because I did a lot of conference speaking. So I spoke, like, my biggest audience was like 2,000, and I thought, if I can go in front of 2,000 people, I can stand on the stage telling some jokes. But it is a very different thing.
Yes.
So it was surprising how not transferable those skills were. And to be honest, I think comedy has really allowed me to get to know myself in a totally different way, because I couldn't rely on those skills that in business, there are some skills that are transferable, of course, but there's a lot of business is about seeming like you are in control or that you know what you're doing, while comedy is very much about vulnerability and showing what you don't do well, or stories about what happened that didn't turn out like you thought. So comedy has been such a great teacher of vulnerability for me.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it. So would you say you feel more, or most, a comedian is more themselves when they're presenting than a business person giving a talk?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think comedy is just so hard. It's so, because it is, there are certain rules in comedy where you shouldn't punch down. So the status of who you are and what the audience is like, it matters a lot. So you do kind of have to be
Self-deprecating.
It's self-deprecating.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to make fun of yourself.
Yes.
And that sometimes can be, I think a lot of comedians do too much of it. And then, if you repeat things all the time that is kind of negative about yourself, I don't think that's very good for your mental health. In fact, I don't know whether there's an Australian comedian called, what is she called? Hannah Gatsby, who did a show called Ninette, I think it's called. And that whole comedy special is about how she used the vulnerability of things that were traumatic in her life to make people laugh. But it can also come back to you and become quite toxic. Most comedians tell jokes that maybe makes them feel a bit uncomfortable, but they do it because they want people to laugh, and that high of making people laugh is such a draw,
and it diffuses the perceived authority that they have. If they're willing to make fun of themselves, then it kind of relaxes the room, doesn't it, as well?
It does.
Yeah, but I agree. It can be overdone. It almost looks self-indulgent if that's the sole sort of subject.
Yeah, and I think it's like, before I started comedy, I was actually supposed to, after selling my company, I was supposed to start a master's in applied neuroscience.
Okay,
so
it's quite a shift.
It's quite a shift. That's probably why my friends were so shocked, to be fair. My big interest field has always been psychology and especially neuroscience. And I actually was reading something this morning about, I don't know whether you know Carl Jung, who was actually a humanist, and his views and his thoughts is something that I found really fascinating, where it kind of it goes across a lot of different fields, not just psychology, but also physics and religion and thoughts that are, I think, energetically connected. And I think the reason I decided to do comedy instead of that degree was because I had never done anything just for me. Like, I'd been a very responsible person all my life. I took care of my mother, my siblings. Then I moved to London, and then I had my oldest daughter when I was just 26. And so I then went to have a business to be responsible for like 50 people. So I think the comedy has been me reclaiming me as a person. And through that, I've learned a lot about who I am, and I've also learned a lot about psychology and then groups together. Because if you can make a whole room laugh, that have, you know, most audiences, there are very different types of people there, and that could be a really powerful thing to bring people together, and it's very addictive.
Yeah, I can imagine so, but also very unifying.
Yes.
And so, what role do you see comedy playing in society today, especially with a view towards sensitive issues? You mentioned, you know, there's a sort of unwritten rule that you don't punch down, but do you think there is anything that should be off limits, and how respectful should we be to, you know, different viewpoints?
Yes, it's a very good question. I have a quote that I really like that sums this up. And you're probably going to ask me who it was by, and I never remember. I just remember the words. I remember stories, not names. But the saying goes, the quote goes, if you are going to tell someone the truth, make sure to make them laugh, or they will kill you.
That's excellent.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Is like,
yeah,
with comedy, is almost the last thing that is left where you really do have free speech. And if you can, and I really do believe that you can change someone's view of a topic if you can make them laugh about it. It is and maybe this is why comedy is so interesting to me from a neuroscience and psychology point of view, because I believe that if you can unify people in laughing and you can teach them something, they will remember it. So there are loads of comedians that are very political or very focused on telling things that they really believe in, and they have great impact. And like, for example, the Ukrainian president, he used to be a comedian. You know, there is a lot of truth that can be told through humor.
Yes, if you can wrap it up in, as you say, well-meaning joke, or bring someone along on the story and unite the room, there is that opportunity to at least influence change.
Yes, for sure. But then you're right. There's also a lot of, I see a lot of comedians telling jokes about topics that I do not think is okay.
What would be something you would consider off limits?
Rape. I don't think it's ever okay to make jokes about rape or anti-Semitism or racism, sexism, anything like that. I just don't think is okay. And I don't think, as you know, there are people like Ricky Gervais that makes a lot of jokes about things that he makes jokes about to shock people, and he kind of wraps it up pretending that this will make us speak about it. No, you are just doing it to get the attention for it. And I, like, as a humanist, I don't think you should ever say anything unless you mean it. And we can all have views that might be controversial, but you can still say that in a way that's respectful and not punching down. I think that's just, I really dislike that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think I agree, there's a lot more comedians going for the shock effect. That's it. It's not necessarily going for finding the humor or finding that shared experience that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And bringing the room together. What advice would you have for anyone who might be considering a career change, or at least trying their hand at stand-up comedy?
So I would say go for it. Like it is a challenging industry because there's a lot of competition, but it's also a very welcoming and friendly industry, and there's a lot of opportunities out there. If you want to do stand-up comedy, I would recommend starting with a course, because that really gives you an opportunity to in a group setting work on jokes, and then also usually you have a showcase and a performance at the end. And for me, that was the way that I went. And I know loads of comedians that just went on an open mic and started. For me, I think the best way is to do a course first. Just even being told, like, don't punch. What does it mean punching down? How does the rhythm of how you speak matters? Or, there's a lot of things that goes into this. Like, you might only have like 5 or 10 minutes, but every word matters.
Yeah, I had a go and did a stand-up course about 5 years ago now.
Oh, fun.
Sounds like a similar process, eventually finished with a 5-minute set that was well vetted by the coach before we went on stage. It was a very welcoming and, friendly crowd. So, got a bit of a free pass. But I would, I didn't stick with it, but I would almost recommend that for anybody who is potentially going to do any kind of public speaking or public facing role, because of some of the exercises that you mentioned, one of which was just standing in front of the rest of the group, and everybody had to, with no filter, tell you what their immediate perceptions of you were just by how you looked and how your voice sounded. So you can know a bit more about how you come across to people, which can be very surprising. It might not be, you may not want to hear it at first, but it's incredibly helpful to know how you come across.
Yeah. It is so fascinating how and it's quite a rude awakening, but this, just knowing how you come across will be useful in any business situation as well as comedy. And so that is also a classic thing. A lot of people start off their set with like, I know what you're thinking, I look like this and that, or like, I bet my accent is really funny because I'm Norwegian, but I've been here for a long while. So I always have to address that so they don't spend my entire set thinking about where the accent is from.
That's good. Yeah, deal with those questions that they might be dealing with. Yeah, and I think the other point that always stuck with me was on the writing side. The coach will go through your script and effectively reduce it by 50% and delete any unnecessary words. So it really is, every word is in service of a setup or a punchline, and that's a good practice to remember when you're writing in the business world as well, or in anybody. Really get to the point and don't waffle.
Yes, for sure. And also how you end, like how many words you use for the punchline, or if you accidentally give away what the joke might be by giving too much information at the start, then the punchline is ruined.
Yes, that's a really good point. So how do you measure success in your comedy career, and is there any achievements so far that stand out for you?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I have agonized over this. So I haven't been going like that long. It's like 18 months or something. And at the start, I measured everything by whether people laughed. And I no longer do that because people are so different. Not everyone laughs out loud. And a lot of people will smile or nod. And you could say that, it's only really successful if people laugh out loud, but I don't think so anymore. It is very much energy for me. Like I will feel whether the energy was good and whether people enjoyed it. Like if I didn't get any laughs, I would go home and cry probably. But the energy is more about the success and how it feels. And for me, it makes a big difference when there's a decent sized audience. So if, a lot of things in comedy, especially when you start, it's only like 10 other comedians in a pub. And those gigs are hard. But so then when you start getting those bigger gigs and you have a decent sized audience, like the Comedy Store I did only like 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that was 400 people. And it felt amazing. And that was definitely a great highlight, because then you can really feel how all your work is paid off, because with a bigger audience, it does make a huge difference.
So a lot of it's on the vibes, on how it feels after each show.
It's like the same as going to a party. Like if you go to a party, the way you have good time isn't by how many people laughed at it or
by counting the people in the room. Yeah.
It is all about the vibe of how you felt and whether you connected. And a lot of comedy is also connecting with people and seeing their faces and seeing their eyes. And, that's why comedy is so addictive. It's, the connection through laughing. It is like an imprint of a good time, isn't it?
Yes, I think this is getting into your psychology training here. That joint experience of all laughing together. There must be something deep rooted within us, right?
Yeah.
And in terms of your career ahead, what aspirations do you have in your comedy career?
So I don't have like a big want to be on TV or anything like that. I would love to be on Live at Apollo. I think that's every comedian's main objective, is to get to the Live at the Apollo. I also would really like to do a show at the Edinburgh Fringe and write a really well written show that is about something I care about. And I'm not really in comedy to tell jokes. I'm in comedy to tell my story in a way that will engage people and entertain people. So I don't I did loads of I got a lot of advice from different experienced comedians in the last 6 months in particular. And the thing I realized, and these are really experienced, successful comedians, but the thing I realized is I don't want to write jokes about what people think that they want to hear from me. I want to write about what I want to say, and I want to make that funny. So that is like my main objective. But yeah, I don't have I don't necessarily want to be famous comedian. I think it's more about connecting with people and doing it in a different way than what I did when I was in business and doing conferences.
That's wonderful, yeah. And do you think it's important for us as humanists, non-religious people, to laugh at ourselves and find the funny in our own views?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think religion and thoughts of life and connection, and this is where most great humor lies. And I think it's an important human experience to laugh at yourself and to make fun of things you do. Yeah,
I'm hoping we're going to have plenty of that when we gather for the Christmas party. I think I've laid down the challenge to all of the acts to try and find the funny in humanism rather than poking fun at religion, which I think has been probably overdone by this point.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And that's the thing. But I think the thing that I connect with the most with humanism is for the thing that I know for sure is that humans need humans, and we need to support and connect, and more now more than ever. Having an organization like a humanist organization is so important, because the communities that we had in history are eroding, and there are less people that are religious, and those people need community and connection, maybe even more so. And I think that is having people come together with the same values is such a important part of life.
Absolutely, yeah. There's finding positive ways to replace those positive elements for sure. And just a few quick fire questions before we go. When you need to laugh, what's your most reliable resource, either a comedy hero or just in your everyday life? What makes you laugh the most?
Oh, so my comedy hero is very unusual. It's a Canadian comedian called Mitch Hedberg. He's
I think I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, he was big in the 90s and noughties. I think he died quite young. But it's all very silly, observational humor that just makes me roll over laughing. And I find, for me, like having conversations with friends about really silly things. Also, I am great at pranks. I love a prank. And in fact, there are loads of comedians all around London that have asked me to film their sets when they perform. And I've always pointed out, look, I did work in tech for 15 years. Are you sure you're okay to have your phone with me? And they're like, ha ha ha, so funny. And then I always go into their phone, change the autocorrect from Lisa. So every time they type Lisa, it changes it to goddess. So the amount of people in London just calling everyone that's called Lisa goddess, I think.
Well, you'll have to change your name if more people are ended up calling you that.
Yeah.
It goes too far. Thank you so much, Lisa. Just before we go, our usual wrap-up question. What's something that you've changed your mind on recently?
What is something I have changed my mind on recently? Wow, weirdly, that is the hardest questions I've had. Have I changed my mind about something recently? I don't know. I do weirdly. The funny thing is, my friends always say the most interesting thing about me is that I go into things really quickly and I will start executing, but I'm really good at changing my mind. So I might go for think that I want to do something, and then I'll change my mind rather than hesitate to execute. So I think I'm so good at changing my mind all the time that I can't think of one thing.
That makes sense. I think we're probably going to have another conversation sometime about the qualities and values of changing your mind, particularly in the business world, and how to pivot, for sure.
Yeah.
But Lisa May, we're really looking forward to having you join us at the Christmas party with the Central London Humanists. And thank you so much for your time and joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Humanism Now. And thank you very much again to Lisa May for joining us on this week's episode. Really fascinating person. She covered so many topics there. AJ, what did you take away from the interview?
I can't wait to meet her. She's going to be at the event on the 13th of December in London, our Christmas party and stand-up event for charity. So I'm going to be rushing to talk to her then. Having a neuroscience and neuropsychology background, being interested in stand-up comedy, loving Japanese culture. She's a Japanophile just like me. So yeah, it was a pleasure to listen to, and I'm looking forward to discussing more with her and seeing what I can learn about these topics that we both have in common and a shared passion for. There was talking about her early life and her sort of the scars that she carries with her, and also her comedy kind of experiments and failures. I was reminded of this quote. I think it's from Hemingway, that says, he says, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong in the broken places." She also referred to kintsugi. I think that was the word she was searching for, which is the Japanese art of broken pottery being mended using gold liqueur. So the scars and the way, a particular pot or a dish may be broken, that's kept in its remade design. So you see the fault lines where it broke. And actually becomes more valuable, not just because of the gold, but because of the particular pattern and the way that it broke. And dishes are actually smashed on the floor and then they're remade purposefully. So kintsugi and the Hemingway quote really stuck with me. And I think she seems to be a fantastic ambassador for humanism, without meaning to be one officially, talking about how giving a very inspirational life lesson for people who want to pursue something. She was in, as you said, the corporate world. When she came back over, she jumped ship to comedy, very independent. It's people telling you what to do from all sides, and how do you decide where to go and how to pitch your own particular brand of comedy in a very, very crowded market. So all of these things were pricked up my ears. I guess coming to the comedy specifically, and the idea of not punching down. And this kind of links to what we were saying in the first part of the episode. I agree with her, but I would disagree with her in one thing, in that she seemed to be quite firm in saying no, I definitely wouldn't joke about racism or abuse or, some of these topics. And I think I can see why she's saying that. In principle, I agree. I mean, it's not a fun thing to talk about, especially when people are suffering and they're innocent victims of some of the most horrible aspects of our society. But I think that result can be achieved in a different way, in a different perspective or a different stance if we have. And the one that I like is the one that Johnny Carson, the famous American late TV show host, said. He said that 80% of the job as a stand-up comedian is to get the audience to like you. Just be a nice person. If you do that, most of the job is done, and then they'll be more likely, they're more relaxed, and they're more likely to sort of give you a laugh in some sense. And Jerry Seinfeld speaks of almost like an assassin. You have to get in, make them laugh, and get out before they even realize that they laughed at something potentially that could be hurtful to them, or as in like maybe damaging to their ego, or like George Carlin giving them a moral lesson. But they laugh, you get them, you steal the laugh, and then you're on to the next topic, or then, bye, see you next time. So that aspect of almost having to surreptitiously navigate some people's, the audience's sensitive spots and triggering topics, I think that is something to that. So I think following Johnny Carson's advice, if there is a way to make a joke about racism while still being nice, then by all means try and find a way of doing it. And I think maybe some people, maybe Dave Chappelle in some of his moments have found a way. But in the majority of cases, there's no way of doing that. I mean, I certainly can't do that because either I'm not a nice enough person or I'm not a clever enough comic. So yes, in our civilization, there may be a handful of people, again, on our Mount Rushmore, who possibly could do that. But if they fail that first test, if they try to do it and they end up not being a nice person, then they should, as a comedian, as a humble comedian, and as a comedian who cares about making the audience laugh, they should avoid those topics. So I would agree with her end result that we shouldn't have jokes about rape or racism or whatever. But it's about, I would approach it in this way, that in principle, we're humanists, we believe in free speech. I believe in, I don't think there should be, short of direct calls for incitement to violence or hatred, I don't think there should be arbitrary sort of pre-limits on free speech. So I think that applies to comedy. So being in sync with our humanist values, I would be a bit more open to free speech than Lisa was in how she describes it. But I would say the empathy aspect of humanism, being a nice person, that is a good enough of a calibrator factor. That's a good enough of a criteria as a guide to make sure that we don't end up insulting the audience or end up causing, social unrest because of the topics that we cover. So yeah, I'm very grateful for her for raising these topics, and I'm going to take that away with me.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I was surprised by her quite firm stance on the topics that were not suitable for comedy, only because I felt previously there's a kind of stock answer from comedians on this, which is nothing should be off limits. There are just things that I personally wouldn't joke about. And so I was grateful for her being so upfront about that. And I think it is always good to know to consider where people's limits are. But I definitely think there's a skill which, as you say, the top comics have, which is kind of working off the discomfort of the audience and helping to relax the audience around what might be otherwise an uncomfortable topic. And that comes from building that trust and empathy, as you mentioned, and going, I know this, knowing the comic well enough or feeling like you can relate to them well enough to know, I don't think this person has bad intentions. They're going to talk about this controversial topic. They're going to bring me along on this. And there's a relief in being able to say, okay, the target of the
They are an ally. Yeah, they're not an enemy.
Yeah, the target of the joke is not the vulnerable person, but they're able to play on things. And she did mention a couple of examples, I think, of comics who possibly have not maybe thought they've got that level of trust, but actually, I think it is difficult to come across that way and to maintain that skill. Nicole, what's your view? Should any subject be off limits for comedy?
Yeah, I don't think it should at all. Like AJ said, I believe in absolute free speech, as long as it's not incitement to hatred or violence. That's the sort of thing. And again, I totally understand why certain comedians would be like, I won't joke about this, but I don't think it should be banned. I think it's really important for a myriad of reasons. One being that if someone is telling actually like genuinely hateful jokes, if they don't say them, then how can you start to dismantle those ideas? If someone came to you and was like, oh, I really liked this, really racist comedian or something, then you might be like, oh, is it that play coming from a place of hate, or is that coming from, oh, you just think this is funny to like mock, and it's kind of getting those things out in the open. And again, and free speech comes with also criticism. If someone does tell really racist jokes or something, then hopefully lots of people will be like, hey, that's actually really racist. And until they get that out, how can you start having these conversations? I also think a lot of comedy comes from, what you shouldn't say. And it depends who the joke is against. But I think sometimes it's the shock of certain things is what's funny. But for me, when I would stop finding it funny, it's who is the punchline against and what is the punchline? And if it's like we're saying punching down, I personally don't think that's a nice thing to do, especially if the comedian is perceiving it, they're like, oh, I'm just joking about this. But it's like, okay, but are your audience going to be like, oh yeah, I actually do hate insert group here? And I think that's the important thing that comedians should think about is how, even if they're not intending it, if they're just, oh, I'm just joking. It's like, okay, but how are people going to take it? And again, it comes from, I think, like I was saying earlier, the true understanding of something, making a true funny joke. So, for example, I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, my background is Jewish. And, there's a really strong Jewish comedian tradition, including Jerry Seinfeld, who's been brought up a lot. And I've forgotten the guy.
Larry David.
But so when Jewish people make jokes about themselves, obviously it's not racist, firstly, because it's themselves, but they understand themselves and Jewish people. So their jokes are coming from a place of understanding. So that's why they're funny. Whereas if you had like an anti-Semite just making racist jokes, it's like, well, that's just racist. It's not funny.
Definitely. Yeah. I think it's also, it's a good point. It's a good sense check on where the population is with their moral standards as well. I mean, if we think about the working men's clubs comics of the 70s and perhaps into the 80s, where there were outright racist jokes, the audiences were laughing, and people wouldn't get away with those jokes now. It's quite a simple test, really, that comedians have to do. They won't keep a joke in if the audiences aren't laughing at it. So if they try content that people don't agree with or they find uncomfortable, it's not going to persist. So I think when you see or you hear old jokes, it's not just a reflection on the comedian and their own views. It's also a reflection of what was the population's kind of moral standards like at the time. So I think it shows that our own progress, that certain things just aren't, comedians wouldn't even consider them, testing them out as funny anymore. And it's also a good point in terms of who makes the joke. I went to go and see Trevor Noah a couple of nights ago, and he does material about people of all different races. And again, that he is telling jokes that I think a white comedian almost certainly couldn't do. And so a lot of it is about the context. And again, he's been on TV, as you mentioned. He's built up a reputation for a long time in fighting for and championing good causes. He can do these things, and he can bring the audience along with him, and there's no malice there. So, I think who is saying it, whether you can sense they have a deep level of understanding, makes a big difference.
I'd really recommend to listeners to check out Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, which is a series by Jerry Seinfeld on Netflix, and also his documentary, I think it's maybe from the early 2000s, called Comedian. That's also on Netflix. That's just a documentary movie. And I think both of these, they gave me an insight into the workings of comedians' mindsets and, when they're off stage. And because Jerry Seinfeld is a comedian himself, a legendary one, him talking to other comedians, and he talks to a wide range of them, including people from black minority ethnic backgrounds and also white comedians, young, old. And there is what are the unifying threads in there? It's very interesting to see. And I think we should bear that in mind before jumping to judge comedians. At least I try and do it because I've never done it in my life. You said that you've tried it, James. I'm very inspired that you have tried it, because I think stand-up comedy is arguably the most difficult art form, more than acting, more, sort of public speaking, they say is the worst one that people always have a fear of. But I think stand-up comedy is even more than that. And so far be it for me to judge someone like Lisa, because I think every comic has to find their own comfortable patch and what stories they want to tell and why they're coming to comedy. And that's certainly not unique, and there's no one formula that fits everyone. But in terms of the mechanics of how they approach getting material, it's really important, as we said before, I think, to allow them to experiment, to workshop material. And now, because people have devices that they can record on, and you can go viral from just trying to experiment on some material in a really, really small club, and they build up those. And as you say, I think it's a really key point. The comedian is a reflection of society. Unless they are just a really hateful person that somehow made it into comedy and they just want to spew hate, and they should be filtered out quite quickly because they shouldn't be successful. The other ones who really care about making people laugh, it's that moment of, Jerry Seinfeld calls it the moment of weightlessness, that is just laughing. That's what they're addicted to. That's all they care about, really. And Lisa also said that herself, and that reminded me of that. And that kind of shows that she's from the same, she's made out of the same thread and the same cloth as Jerry and many other comedians. So that's all they're after. And maybe audiences don't understand that there sometimes isn't a big agenda behind it. They just want to get to something, a pattern of words and sounds that makes people laugh at the end of it. And whatever sounds funny, they will try and grasp and experiment with, kind of like a monkey playing with sticks, Jerry Seinfeld says, and until they find something that's funny. But sometimes they may stray into things that sort of, okay, the audience isn't quite ready for that yet. And what jokes comedians say amongst themselves are different to what they say to their audiences. So they do have filters, they do have levels, and they're very, very, that's how they get their bills paid at the end of the day. So they're very, very sensitive towards that. And we should pay them the respect of allowing them to experiment certain works. But I can agree, it's difficult now because of social media. You can get cancelled, or you can get, even when a comedian is workshopping something in a small club and seeing how it plays, they need that feedback because they need to judge that before they go and play at do a Netflix special or play at a massive stadium event. And if you don't allow for these spaces to exist, not only is that damaging comedy, but then that also has spillover effects that's also how we learn. We learn by workshopping ideas in universities and discussion groups and philosophy groups and debating groups. If we don't allow these spaces to exist, then, this may be we maybe lose some stand-up comedians, but that same culture of stifling and, chilling culture can have other repercussions in other aspects of our society, which I think is not in the humanist, sets of values at all.
Absolutely well said, AJ. And thank you both for your time this week. Just before we go, is there any upcoming events with any of your groups that you'd like to mention? I know you're both very active with the Young Humanists. Anything planned around the Christmas season?
No, not as such. We're planning our schedule for next year, but we are inviting all young humanists who are in the London area to come to the 13th of December CLH event, the stand-up comedy event. It is a fundraiser for charity as well, so I think that will be good. And we've got some partnerships that we've made with LSE and some other humanist students, which we're hoping to build on for next year. But yeah, next week or in the 13th of December event in a few weeks' time, we're just going to be bringing a lot of London friends together, and also people who can join us from outside of London, and celebrating the year that's gone by and looking ahead to the year ahead, 2024. So that will be a headline event. But please do watch this space on Young Humanist socials for the next events that we'll be able to announce.
Great. And Nicole, anything exciting happening with the Leicester Humanists?
Yes, so I think I've mentioned this before, but on the 6th of December, which is a Wednesday, next Wednesday, we're doing a viewing party of the Blackham Lecture, which this year is on ADHD. And I think that's something that a lot of humanists have professed an interest in, and neurodivergence. So if anybody's around for that and in the Leicester area, please feel free to come along. I think the details will be in the podcast.
We'll definitely share that, as well as details for our Central London Christmas comedy fundraiser. Please do come along and join us. It'd be great to meet more members and listeners at that event. And please do keep sending in your questions and feedback to humanise.live@gmail.com. And all that remains is to thank Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Good to see you again.
A pleasure. Thanks, James.
And thank you for tuning in and joining us on Humanism Now.